Good afternoon. Hello. Um, it's not working. Yeah, I know.
Test.
Okay, now it's on. All right, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're really delighted to be hosting Gioia Diliberto today. She's here to talk about her new book, Firebrands, the untold story of four women who made and unmade Prohibition. This is a great time, isn't it, for a book about several women who played an influential role in American history, given, of course, this week's vote and the hope that we will see the first woman elected president of the United States. Although, as Gioia asserts, the four women she profiles have largely been forgotten, they were very prominent in the battle over Prohibition in the 1920s and early 1930s. They weren't all on the same side, and Gioia in a minute will describe their specific roles. But she frames their stories together as the first expression of women's political activity following the passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, granting women voting rights. Each woman in the book, in her own ways and facing her own challenges in what was still a male-dominated world, sought to build on the momentum of suffrage and fight for power. While, as Gioia notes, the link between suffrage and prohibition has been well documented, her point in bringing the stories of these four women together in one narrative is to show, she says, not only how prohibition shaped their interconnected lives, but also how it involved the struggle of women post-suffrage to win influence in American politics. It's a very interesting and useful way to structure the book, and Gioia is very experienced as a journalist and author at telling women's stories. In addition to 3 historical novels and a play, she's written several nonfiction narratives about women, among them biographies of Diane von Furstenberg, Jane Addams, and Hemingway's first wife, Hadley Richardson. Now, in conversation with Gioia here this afternoon will be one of the leading voices in American journalism, male or female, New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd. Her columnizing, for which she's received a Pulitzer, consistently provides as much punch, insight, and wit as you'll find anywhere. Plus, Maureen herself has written 3 best-selling books. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Gioia Diliberto and Maureen Dowd.
Thank you so much. I have props. Gioia is one of my oldest and most favorite friends. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. We met in the 80s when I was working at Time magazine and Gioia was working at People. And I was writing about the Contras and throwweights, and she was writing covers on Princess Diana, so you can imagine who was better read. I love her book because this is so odd, but my dad was a DC police detective in the 20s, and his job was to enforce prohibition. And funnily enough, I didn't know that much about it. I didn't realize that it was pushed by women, and the push to repeal it was by women. So I dragged my dad's old scrapbook in here, which is falling apart, just to tell you a couple things. So in here, you can find things like this poem, Whiskey Did It All, which is the story of a man who lost his sweet home because it was caused by bad whiskey. And now I sadly roam, penniless, friendless, and that's why I have no home. So then here's one called Whiskey, the Real Murder of Marjorie O'Donnell. So it's about a woman at the National Geographic Society who got murdered by her suitor. And this newspaper story makes the case that it was whiskey that weakened her natural inhibitions, forcing her to forget her early convent training, leading her into temptation and dragging her to the grave. Cheery. And it was whiskey that obliterated all signs of decency from her boyfriend. Whiskey is the real slayer. They think whiskey should be sent to the electric chair. My dad was not anti-drinking, but he was not much of a drinker for an Irish person. So I think as we're on the cusp of a possible first woman president, this is an amazing story because it's the whole story of how women first voted and got power and learned to use power. And all these women in the book use it quite differently. There's one beautiful socialite who uses it kind of like Nancy Pelosi does, combined with her beautiful pearls and silks and, mesmerizing the guys all over Washington. And then there are others who use it with less cleverness and blunt force. And Gioia has written several fantastic novels and nonfiction books about women, and they always reflect their eras. And I'm just going to, because it is focused on 4 women, I'm just going to read you the description of the 4 women in the book flap. We meet Ella Boole, the stern and ambitious leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who campaigned fiercely to introduce prohibition and fought desperately to keep it alive. We also meet Mabel Walker Willebrandt, the most powerful woman in America, who served as the top federal prosecutor charged with enforcing prohibition. We also meet the wild and crazy silent film star, Texas Guinan, yeah, who ran New York speakeasies backed by the mob and showed that prohibition was not only absurd, but unenforceable. And she follows Pauline Morton Sabine, a glamorous Manhattan aristocrat who belatedly recognized the cascading evil in prohibition and mobilized the movement to kill it. So these are the women who, got prohibition passed, and then also the women who killed it. So Gioia, tell us how you found this story and why you were drawn to it.
Thank you, Maureen. Can everyone hear me? Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge Pauline Saban's granddaughter, who is here, Sheila Cochran. I am so thrilled to have Sheila here, and it's a testimony to how close the jazz age is. We have your father's scrapbook, and we have Sheila, who's a living connection to that past. And also, Sheila very generously allowed me to go through her grandmother's scrapbooks, which were voluminous and had incredible things in them that gave me details I never would have had if she hadn't allowed me to do that. So I will be forever grateful to her. And we also have Link Nickel, who is a granddaughter of Pauline Sabin's right-hand woman, Eone Nickel. And I also had the great pleasure and good luck of having Eone Nickel's scrapbook, which was also filled with incredible things that I never would have discovered on my own, which enabled me to bring the story to life on the page. So Pauline Sabin and Eone Nickel, though, were not how I originally came to the story. I originally came to the story through another character named Mabel Walker Willebrandt while I was researching a different project completely. And Mabel was, as Maureen said, the most powerful woman in the US government in the 1920s. She was in charge of enforcing Prohibition. She was a young, inexperienced lawyer from California, and she was imported to be the Assistant Attorney General in charge of Prohibition. And they gave the job to her because it was an impossible job. So, why not give it to a woman, number one? And number two, it was Harding who appointed her. And I think he and the other men who were, all hopeless drunks thought, she's just going to be a pushover. We can just, do anything we want with her. And she turned out to be a terror. So her job was impossible. They made it impossible for her, but she was not the easy pushover that they had hoped she was going to be. And I saw her on the cover of Time magazine in the late 20s, and I thought, what? Who is this person? And then I also started wondering what other women of accomplishment were featured on the cover of Time, because most of the women who were on the covers of Time were tennis stars or opera divas. There weren't even Hollywood actresses, because they were considered not respectable. So I started looking through all the covers of Time magazine from 1920 to the 30s, and it was opera diva, tennis star, opera diva, tennis star. And then I came across Pauline Sabin, who was this incredible woman who started the organization that led to the repeal of Prohibition. And then I started thinking, what? So women were the force that got Prohibition passed in the first place. And then another woman, Mabel from California, was in charge of enforcing Prohibition. And then another woman was in charge of the organization, of founding the organization that got it repealed. And I thought, this is a woman's story. I thought you can look at Prohibition, this crazy period of American history, you can look at it through a feminist lens. And I added to the mix Texas Guinan, who was a very flamboyant silent film star who became the hostess of the most prominent speakeasies in New York, because it was a book about power, and she was as interested in power as all the other characters, because she was kind of the mayor of the demi-monde, where the gangsters who owned the speakeasies and the corrupt cops and judges and the society folk and the Hollywood people kind of all mixed together. And of course, Ella Boole, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was extremely powerful and important at the time, had to be in the story. And she's sort of the villain of the piece. But she was very famous at the time, and she had the ear of every president during that period, and was herself very interested in power. In fact, the book opens the day after women's suffrage is passed, when Ella Boole files a petition to run for U.S. Senate from New York. So she didn't make it, but she tried.
Yeah, this book is so much fun because, it has scenes like women smashing up saloons, and then And then when they do that, at one point, this is early in 1854, and Abe Lincoln is the lawyer for some of these women, and he uses as his legal premise the Boston Tea Party to argue on their behalf. And there are flappers with flasks and their garter belts and crazy gangsters. I mean, it's a very colorful story, because the more they tried to suppress drinking, the more people wanted to drink. In the 20s, Congress was in the grip of a fanatical minority, not unlike now. And why does America over and over again get in this situation, where the majority will of the people is ignored on these big issues? Now we have climate change and abortion, but then drinking. It wasn't like the majority wanted to have prohibition.
No, the vast majority of Americans hated prohibition and almost immediately wanted it repealed. And there were almost immediately efforts to chip away at it with bills in Congress for 2% beer and things like that. And but the Congress was, as Maureen said, in the grip of this minority of fanatics who were too weak and craven to stand up for what was right and for what the people wanted. I mean, it does really sound familiar. And there had been lots of organizations started by men to do something about getting prohibition overturned, but there was also this fatalistic attitude, and this could explain maybe why this happens. And I think some of this has happened now, today, and in recent history in America, this fatalistic idea of, well, we can't do anything about it. And in the case of prohibition, it's in the Constitution. In fact, Ella Boole from the Women's Christian Temperance Union and her friends had a song that the refrain of it was, "It's in the Constitution, it's here to stay." And I think there was just this feeling that we're going to have to live with this, because no amendment in the Constitution had ever been repealed. And in fact, in the Black community, there was some opposition to efforts to chip away at prohibition or to repeal prohibition, because they were afraid that if you repeal one constitutional amendment, it makes all the others vulnerable, and they were worried about protecting the so-called civil rights amendments that were passed after the Civil War. So there was a lot of fear and confusion and fatalism surrounding this feeling of we're stuck with prohibition.
Yeah. So one other thing I wanted to tell you. So I was covering the Al Smith dinner recently, and Trump was there, and I was looking at my dad's scrapbook because he saved every newspaper story and obit on Al Smith. And I had never realized, so Gioia's book is about the wets and the dries. So the wets, want to repeal prohibition, and the dries don't. And I had never realized that Al Smith had tried out as a slogan, Al Smith, he'll make your wet dreams come true, not realizing the double entendre. But, we've been thinking a lot about when this is the biggest gender gap in history, this election, and, how women get power and how they are kept from power. And when women got the vote in 1920, people assumed they'd vote as a bloc, but that never was the case, and which I realized when I covered Hillary Clinton and Ferrara's campaigns. And Gioia, we'll talk about that. I mean, because
Yeah.
suffrage and prohibition were so braided.
Right, right. Well, at first, men didn't want to give women the vote, but then when they realized they were probably not going to get prohibition passed unless they gave women the vote. They decided they wanted their votes. And so prohibition and suffrage kind of went hand in hand in terms of their passage. They came run right after the another, prohibition first, and then suffrage. And after suffrage, when the electorate doubled, the male politicians thought, oh, we better pay attention to these women because we want their votes. They didn't want to give them any real power, but they wanted their votes. And so at first, they threw them little things here and there, that the women wanted. Like there was a law passed to protect women and children. But very quickly, they realized that women weren't going to vote as a bloc. And as soon as they realized that, they decided they didn't have to pay attention to women's needs at all. And in fact, that law that they passed to protect women and children was later repealed. So it's a very complicated thing. The polling and the voting records going that far back are not very accurate. But one thing that astounded me was that women did not rush to vote after suffrage. The numbers of women who voted were not very high, and there weren't very many women who ran for office. So the immediate results of suffrage were shockingly modest. It took a while for women to get into the habit of voting. They were used to voting places being in saloons where men went, and they heard rumors that, oh, if I vote, I'm going to have to tell everybody how old I am, when all you really had to say was that you were over 21. And they didn't know how to vote. They didn't know what to expect when they went to vote. So there was a lot of confusion around the voting process, and which kept women away. And it was a long time before women actually really embraced their suffrage. And it's also shocking how women vote against their interests. And there were, I think, 54% of voting women voted for Hillary, and only 48% of women over 50. So that could change. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in this election. I mean, there's some evidence that young women are going to vote or have voted in high numbers for Kamala Harris, and it'll be super interesting to see if that is really true, how that breaks down. But up until now, women tend to vote like men, the same. Their voting patterns are the same as men's. And also back in the 20s, women tended to vote with their fathers more than their husbands, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to buy this book for James Carville for Christmas because he told me that the Democrats are in the grip of preachy women. He has no idea until he reads
Preachy women.
this book what the Republicans were in the grip of.
Right.
But also, you said that Prohibition was a precursor to the Me Too movement.
Yes, yeah. I think, Prohibition, we all think Prohibition was all bad. But it came about as a way of protecting women and children. And it really was the Me Too movement of the 19th century and the early 20th century. It was about, protecting women from their drunken husbands, and America was really awash in booze. It still is, I guess, but it was definitely a real problem. Women did not drink back in the middle of the 19th century, and this was a movement that had started. Women were considered the angels in the house. They were considered the centers of moral purity in the community, and to get rid of drink was a way to make women's lives better and the lives of their children better. So it was definitely the Me Too movement, precursor to the Me Too movement.
One really fascinating thing in this book is that we're watching play out in this campaign this division of America's nature, the puritanical side and, you know, the more raffish, easygoing side. And it's really vivid in this book. And it's fascinating because you're watching this woman who's the Assistant Attorney General, Mabel, who is charged with enforcing prohibition. And then all of her bosses, the Hardings drank, right? Or
Right,
Warren
yeah.
Harding drank. And then Herbert Hoover is stopping at the Belgian embassy every night to get a cocktail. And her direct bosses in the Justice Department are all drinking. And it's just an insane kind of schizophrenic situation for her where she's acting like a female Elliot Ness and all the guys around her are just slurping up alcohol. Also, I wanted to talk about, you know, there's this, the whole situation created these odd bedfellows. So the Harlem elites somehow ended up not on the same side, but they were Dries, right? And the Ku Klux Klan were fighting to be Dries, and that was weird. And also, it was very compelling that how frequently segregated the work of white and black women was in both the pro and anti-prohibition camps, which reminded me of what I've read about racial tensions in the 60s and 70s women's movement.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's not a surprise that the country was incredibly racist. And the black community was divided on prohibition because the black clergy really thought that not abstaining from drink was a way to uplift the black community. And in fact, black leaders, going back to Frederick Douglass, had been in favor of abstinence from liquor as a way of uplifting the community. But the more intellectual members of the community felt that it was an infringement on freedom, another infringement on freedom, and also blacks were disproportionately arrested for minor prohibition crimes. And so the intellectuals and the columnists and really felt that prohibition was hurting the black community more than anybody else. And for this reason, they wanted it repealed, but the black clergy remained steadfast in wanting to keep prohibition intact.
So one of the reasons prohibition was passed was because of our forefathers. We're so proud. The
Mostly yours,
Germans, yeah,
Maureen.
when the immigrants came in, the Germans owned beer companies, and the Irish controlled the politics in cities like New York, and the Italians drank wine as part of their cultural rituals. And in fact, I learned from Gioia's book that the derivation of the word speakeasy was in Ireland, where it meant like speak softly so the people outside don't hear us drinking in here. And so how did how did our forefathers affect this whole debate?
How did our
Well,
yours and mine?
Irish and
yours
Irish
more,
and Italian.
Well, there was also this great fear and loathing of immigrants at the time. I mean, sound familiar again? You know, it's the same old, same old. And there, as Maureen mentioned, there was prejudice against the owners of the beer companies, who all were German. And this is, of course, right after World War I. And there's, you know, which fuels the hatred for Germans. And that led to enthusiasm for closing down, shutting down the distilleries, and so on. And there was this idea that it was the immigrants who were bringing over drinking culture and infecting Native Americans with their drinking culture. And the Tammany politicians, for example, in New York, who were Irish and were running their machine out of the saloons. And that was another reason to get rid of booze and get rid of them. So it was fueled, that effort to pass prohibition was definitely fueled by anti-immigration feeling.
I don't think I'm going to ruin the end of the story for you guys, because you know what happened. But Gioia writes that it was Hoover's unwillingness to signal an anti-prohibition stance when he was inaugurated in early 1929 that was the match strike leading to Pauline Sabin's decision to vacate her role in the Republican National Committee. She was the glamorous socialite with lots of husbands and mansions who finally got us cocktails back. Before Hoover's refusal to take a stand on the matter, she was understandably concerned about the bootleg-related crimes, the binge drinking, Prohibition inadvertently led to, and the proliferation of speakeasies. So, can you explain how much of a Herculean feat it was to bring about the repeal?
Well, I think it was pretty amazing what Pauline Sabin did. She mobilized American women, and she started this grassroots organization that uh, attracted women from all across the country, from all walks of life, from all races. And okay, she had a lot of money and her friends had a lot of money, and so they were able to throw a lot of money into the organization, but they were really organized like an army. And in fact, she acted more like a general, really, than a reformer. She was so organized, and with Eon, her deputy, they just ran this incredibly tight organization that got out the message, and they were just a publicity juggernaut for repeal. And they also made it fashionable. So it became the cool thing for young women to do. It became super cool to be against prohibition. They made it fashionable. And you know, the whole idea of the flapper, I have this feeling about flappers that it was more of a media construct than anything. And it was mostly something that women dabbled in. You know, they would go out to speakeasies on the weekend, but the number of women who are actually true flappers in the mode of the silent star Clara Bow were pretty few and far between. And even though by the mid-1920s, most women had bobbed their hair, though before that, you got fired from your job if you were a nurse or a teacher and you bobbed your hair, or if you were seen smoking and drinking and going out to speakeasies. But Pauline Sabin made it super, super cool, and that attracted more people. And she had parades, and she declared 1 week repeal week, and did all-out media blitzes across the country, and succeeded where the male organizations failed. And it was really largely because of her efforts. And also the crash helped. People were eager to get the distilleries up and running again, to get the taxes from beer and liquor manufacturing. But it was really Pauline Sabin who managed to spur it along and hurry it up and get the country to repeal, which is an astounding accomplishment when you think that it had never, an amendment to the Constitution had never been repealed before and has never been repealed since.
And then it was harder to get alcohol after that, actually, right?
Right, because once prohibition was repealed, there were all kinds of regulations put in place, and they were put in place by the states. So, for example, Mississippi didn't get rid of prohibition until 1966. But you know, and there were all kinds of blue laws. So before, if you wanted a drink, you went to the local speakeasy, or you went to your bootlegger and you got a case or whatever. Now you had to, like, you know, go to the, depending on where you lived, you know, you would have to wait to go to the store, and maybe you could only get 1 6-pack, and it became something that became easy and fun during Prohibition, became hard afterwards.
I thought it was funny that the state that put the repeal over the top was Utah.
Right.
It's all full
I
of
know.
non-drinking Mormons. So, Gioia, alcoholism rates have been rising in the U.S. for decades. At the same time, particularly among young people, there's been a movement towards sobriety. Sober vacations, sober bars, sober parties, sober sanctuaries at concert venues have proliferated in recent years. Meanwhile, sales of non-alcoholic beer, wine, and spirits are soaring. And there was a essay by a woman in the Financial Times this weekend that sounded very much like the era Joy is writing about. She's like, "You are not taking my alcohol away, so back off." What do you think has sparked today's sobriety trend, and do you think it will last?
It might last. I mean, I think that young people who are hitting their 30s and 40s now drank too much in college, and they're now because there was so much drinking going on for the past 20 years in college, and they're now it's catching up with them, and they've decided to quit. And it's also part of the wellness movement. There's so much focus now on being well and being healthy, and all the evidence suggests that drinking is bad for you on every level, unless you're the sort of person who can have maybe 2 drinks a week or 3 drinks a week or something. So and then marijuana is legalized, so you can smoke joints, you don't have to get drunk anymore. I think that had something to do with it too. But there's definitely more sobriety, and I don't know. I don't know if it'll last. We'll have to see. There's certainly also enough people still getting drunk, so I don't know.
This was another funny thing in Gioia's book. They thought that women were, quote, wielders of the soap, unquote, because they could clean up corruption, the corruption that resulted from Prohibition. Let's just talk about a couple of our favorite moments, and then we'll open it up to questions. One of mine was Mabel Walker Willebrand, who's this assistant attorney general who has to enforce Prohibition, even though she herself drank before Prohibition and wasn't, a prude in any way. Did she overstep in ordering the speakeasy raids on the night of Al Smith's nomination as the Democratic candidate for U.S. president?
Yes, she got in a lot of trouble.
Was she campaigning to be
Yes.
attorney general?
Well, she was doing everything she could to get Hoover elected because she thought he was going to appoint her attorney general, and she was going to be the first woman attorney general in the history of the United States. And I don't think today you'd find an assistant attorney general campaigning for a sitting president, but that's what she did. And she organized this massive raid of New York speakeasies on the night that Al Smith was nominated for the Democratic convention for president. And she had all these imported all the best looking, suavest, most witty Prohibition agents from around the country who could pass as high rollers. And she gave them money for 2 weeks, a month, to wear tuxedos and go out at night and get to know people like Texas Guinan, who ran the speakeasies, and pretend to be just part of the demi-monde. And she said, something's coming. You have to do this. You have to play this role. Something's coming. But she didn't tell them what it was. And then on the night of the convention, she kept them all in an office at downtown on Park Avenue so that they couldn't talk to anybody after she told them what they were going to do. And then she let them out. They went to the speakeasies, and at the appointed hour, they all stood up and said, "This is a raid. You're all under arrest." And it was this huge sweep. It depends on what newspaper account you read about it, but it was
And all these places were right around the New York Times. They were all like
Right, exactly.
44th, 45th, yeah.
And she just had this dragnet. She just like swept all these people up. A lot of them were prominent New Yorkers, and brought some of them to trial. And she, got in a lot of trouble for it. She was, even though she was doing this on Hoover's behalf, he felt that she had overstepped, and he did not appoint her attorney general. He failed to do that. So all of her
And then
efforts
didn't
were
he
for
write
naught.
a memo saying, let's not get women involved
Yes,
here
he didn't want to
anymore?
get.
Yeah.
He didn't think that it was proper to have women involved with the gangster element in the city. And so he thought that a woman might have another high-ranking job, but not the job that Mabel had. And Mabel also, she got hate mail. There were threats on her life. And also she had been divorced, but she had kept the divorce really quiet. She still called herself Mrs. Willebrandt because, you know, as a married woman, she was more respectable. But when she got in trouble for overstepping with Al Smith's nomination, and she also gave a speech to some ministers in the Midwest in which she basically told them, tell your parishioners to go out and vote for Hoover and not this Catholic immigrant Al Smith. She just really was hated by a lot of people, and she'd been kind of a heroine before that, and a heroine to American women, but she was really excoriated in the press and in letters. I saw her letters are at the Library of Congress, and people just, you know, wrote these terrible things that they hope she died, and you know, it was just really awful.
But that's why Pauline Sabin,
Yeah.
that's what propelled her, the hypocrisy of the situation. She hated hypocrisy. And, you know, it's just ridiculous that all the people enforcing it were drinking. So, and finally, why do you think a jury failed to convict Tex Guinan, the most famous speakeasy host in America? She had prostitutes as waitresses. She did lots of things to please the powerful gangsters who were her benefactors.
Yeah,
It was a jury of men.
What? It was a jury. Well, women couldn't sit on federal
She
jury.
was kind of, she seemed like kind of a Mae West type.
She was kind of a Mae West type. She was very close to the biggest gangsters in New York, and the gangsters were funding the speakeasies. It was cool for them to have owned speakeasies, and they wanted to. It gave them glamour. So they were all trying to own speakeasies. They didn't, and most of the speakeasies were at least partially owned by the worst gangsters in New York, who, you know, left their guns at the door, but come on, you know, they were thugs and bad things happened. But I think the reason that the jury acquitted her was because she was very witty on the stand, and the jury did not like that she'd been entrapped by these agents, and also they hated Prohibition, and they thought Prohibition was ridiculous. And so they weren't going to convict her of, and Texas herself didn't drink. And so she was unanimously acquitted. And it was Mabel thought about trying her again, but didn't. And Mabel also failed to acquit Helen Morgan, who was another famous speakeasy operator who had a very popular speakeasy called Helen Morgan's Summer House. And Mabel failed to convict her also. But eventually the mob put an end to Texas Guinan's career. So what Mabel couldn't accomplish with the law and the courts, the mob accomplished with guns and violence.
All right, do you guys have any questions? Yes, do you want
Step to the microphone?
Do you want my microphone?
No, they're right here.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Oh,
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm reading the book, which I'm really finding to be a fascinating read. My name is Nathan Weisler, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm ultimately hoping to teach history with an emphasis on civil rights history. And my question is, one aspect of the book that I found particularly important and interesting, both interesting and important, was reading about Mabel Walker Willebrandt's prosecution of Perry W. Howard and the different political dynamics that were at play. I was wondering if you would be able to speak about the episode, about those trials, because I understand there was more than one trial, and I was also wondering if Mabel Walker Willebrandt ever spoke later about that episode, if she ever had a change of heart about it, or expressed her feelings otherwise. I was also wondering if Perry W. Howard left his own account.
Thank you.
My
That's a-
brother went to Montgomery College,
Really?
so way to go.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. It was a really super interesting case, and very complicated. The Republican, this was also related to trying to get Hoover elected, and Mabel went to prosecute this guy named Perry Howard, who was probably the most famous black guy in DC at the time, who was accused of corruption. There had been rumors about his being corrupt for years, and this was one particular bribe, supposedly, that he had taken, and she instituted proceedings against him, and it was really nasty, because the idea of a white woman prosecuting a black man in the South was just guaranteed for conviction, really, and she did it because, not so much because she believed in Perry Howard's guilt, I don't think, but because she thought it was going to help politically. And it was a shameful episode that she never wrote about it in her papers, and I couldn't find anything that he had written about it either. So if you find something, let me know. I'd like to know about it.
Thank you.
The Ku Klux Klan came to the trial and stared at the jury, intimidating them. It was just really terrible.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My name is Samantha Carl, and I teach a feminist leadership course in DC. So this is quite interesting to me. What I'm trying to understand is, as with Prohibition being like the Me Too movement of the 1920s, but also I can't wrap my head around whether it was good or not. Like was this a positive thing that women were no longer being victims of domestic violence, or were able to organize for social change, and maybe it's a more nuanced appreciation of what it was, but like, is this something we should be like, yes, this was something that women organized, and this was so great that they were able to get this through, and it came along with suffrage? Or was this like they were manipulated into pushing this on behalf of other interests that really weren't for them, and then had to then double back and go against it? So I'd love some help there.
Great question.
Yeah, it was a great question. No, I think that it was an example of what women could do when they got together, and it proved their agency to a certain extent. But then what happened in 1920 was that the suffrage prohibition activists who were aligned so closely were getting old, and like the Carrie Katz of the world, the suffragists who had led the great fight for suffrage, were getting into their 70s, and they were also out of step with the culture, that the flapper culture, the new woman culture. Women were getting educated, and they wanted to go to work, and they wanted to have sexual freedom, and so they just kind of got pushed aside. But I think it served its purpose for the time. I mean, the push for prohibition and suffrage was so tightly close together that you can't really separate them. And was it a good thing? I mean, it was suffrage was a good thing. So you can't really separate the fight for suffrage from the fight for prohibition. So I would never say that prohibition was a good thing, but even though it probably is a good thing not to drink. But yeah, suffrage was unquestionably a good thing, and you can't separate it from prohibition, if that answers your question.
Well, they didn't foresee what would happen with all the corruption and stuff. They were thinking of the positive possibilities.
Right. Yeah.
But then there were so many negatives that they couldn't see.
Nobody envisioned gangsters.
Whenever there's a huge societal revolution, even with marijuana, I mean, that didn't go totally smoothly either. You can't always foresee what's going to happen. But I think they were too strict.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I've always wondered, I'm a physician, among other things, and there's a puritanical streak that runs in this country from the Puritans, that's what they
Right.
were called, about alcohol. And I just wondered how that factored in. The reason I say I'm a physician is because, I mean, I didn't go to medical school till I was 40, but the idea that you would have that someone who drank more than, say, once or twice a month was an alcoholic, they didn't say it exactly, but that's what they think, or at least a lot of doctors do. And that's kind of, it's not never said, but certainly it's not the case in Europe, where I mean, people drank every day. People still drink every day.
Well, it's interesting that the only other country that had a prohibition for a limited period was Finland.
Interesting.
You know, I mean, Britain never had prohibition,
Right.
and other countries didn't have
France,
it.
Italy.
Yeah, no, they never did. And Ella Boole, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of my characters, when after Prohibition was repealed in America, she spent all of her time to the rest of her days traveling around the world, trying to get Prohibition established in other places. So,
So it's true.
yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey there, thank you
Hey.
for coming out, first of all. So I know it's fictional, but there's a scene in the series Boardwalk Empire where
Yes.
Kelly MacDonald's character is talking to a senator who opposes suffrage about prohibition. And she says, you know, if you withhold something from women long enough, they're going to start thinking about things they could withhold from you. And is that a dynamic that you encountered at all in your research?
That the women were trying to punish men.
Not even punish them, but just like exercise leverage without having any actual, without actually having the vote.
You mean when they were trying to pass prohibition?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that character in Boardwalk Empire was based on Mabel Walker Willebrandt.
I thought
Actually.
that was Julianne Nicholson's character who was based on
The what?
her. I thought it was Julianne Nicholson's
The
character.
Julianne
who was
Nicholson's
based on
character,
Jane.
right?
Yeah.
That was the character.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that women, their role in the 19th century was to be the angels of the house, to be the protector of the morals. They were thought to be superior to the menfolk, and it was their job to keep men on the straight and narrow and to raise children with the right values to stay on the straight and narrow. So definitely, I think that was true.
Yeah, it's almost like Lysistrata, you know, except instead of withholding sex, they're withholding alcohol.
Right. And there really was an alcohol problem. You know, on the farms, there was no good water. And so everybody had to drink just beer and liquor, and everybody, the men, not the women, were just drunk all the time. So, but I don't think it was really punitive. I don't think they were thinking, "Ooh, we're going to get them back." You know, they're not giving us the vote, so we're going to take liquor away from them. I don't think that was a quid pro quo, but I definitely think they felt it was a moral responsibility. They were morally superior. It was their job to clean things up.
Thank you.
So, Gioia, why do you think that the women that you wrote about were largely forgotten until now? I mean, you mentioned one or two of them had appeared on the cover of Time, which of course is no guarantee for being remembered, but I'm sure the starlets and the athletes who also appeared on the cover of Time, we do recall, but not these women.
I have no idea why. I don't know. I mean, think of all the other people who've been lost to history also.
Sure.
You know, who are ready to be rescued.
But I mean, is there something about the way the Prohibition, the history of Prohibition, has been covered, has been written about, that that didn't focus on these women?
Well, that could be it. I mean, when you think of Prohibition, you think of gangsters and flappers, and you don't think of the reformers. And certainly Ella Boole, who was just, you know, this sort of stern, pigeon-breasted scold, is not somebody that people want to remember. And in fact, the Women's Christian Temperance Union doesn't really exist anymore. And it was a force, but the membership started declining for starting from after World War II down to the 60s, and now, maybe there are 2 chapters, and that's about it. And they had a newspaper that published. It was the Union Signal, which was the Women's Christian Temperance Union newspaper, was kind of like the Fox News of its day. It just published so much fake news about the consequences of having one drink that could turn you into a blubbering alcoholic, or warning parents that their unborn children would be prone to dying young if the parents drank, and things like that. So I don't think anybody wanted to remember Ella Boole until I resurrected her. And again, these women were associated with reform and with activism in the 1920s, when all people really want to know about are the gangsters and the flappers. So
Right.
maybe that's why. Hi.
Hi. I don't know if this is relevant to the book or whatever, but you talked about how difficult or seemingly impossible it seemed at the time to have a constitutional amendment overturned, which was one of the bedrock things that the Prohibition movement did. I recall reading a book years ago about the election of 1932. I forget who the author was, but it was published by the University Press of Kansas, and it was one of their American presidential election series or whatever. And I was struck when I read that book about how prevalent the issue of prohibition was in that election, in the midst of one of the greatest economic calamities in American history, and particularly how I think Hoover and the Republicans in some respects pushed the dry issue, probably in one respect because he couldn't run on his economic record. So I was wondering if you had any observations in your Prohibition studies about whether that election, obviously Roosevelt won and they were able to, but whether that issue, whether if you've done any study of that election, how surprised you were by the prevalence of prohibition in that campaign.
Well, I'm not an expert on the election, but prohibition definitely was at the forefront of it, because the country needed the revenue from the distilleries and also the jobs that would be created by bringing the distilleries back. Right. And everybody hated prohibition. And also the gangsters were running amok, and there was nothing good about prohibition, and bringing it back was going to, but I mean, repealing it was going to bring revenue in, was going to create jobs, was going to put the gangsters out of business. So it was overwhelmingly seen by the American public as a good thing. And Hoover was wishy-washy. I mean, as Maureen mentioned, he drank. He stopped at the Belgian embassy every night to have a drink. So, but the country really was ready for it to end. And they'd been ready for almost from the moment it began. They'd been ready.
Yeah, the country wanted its wet dreams to
It
come
wanted
true.
its wet dreams to come true.
Yeah. And I guess when Roosevelt was elected, he was like, I got bigger fish to fry, so
Right.
let's get this done and out of
Right,
the way.
right,
And
right. And they were, and it was
Roosevelt loved his cocktails.
yes. Eleanor didn't. Eleanor didn't. Eleanor was in favor of prohibition, actually, and she refused. Eleanor Roosevelt refused to join Pauline Sabin's organization, and she, in fact, had an uncle who was a terrible drunk, and she tried to get him arrested. So, but that was Eleanor. Yeah, and she would never drink at any of the parties that they had, or sometimes she would have a little sarsaparilla, just not to be a total prig.
Yeah, I thought on his memorial they should have let him have his cocktail shaker and cigarette holder. Yeah, it would make it better. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Those were great
Thank you.
questions, and you're a
Thanks.
great audience. And thank you.
you.
Come
Thanks.
back.